Hey, welcome to Faith and Culture Now. Today I'm joined by Dr. Jack Goodyear. Jack, it's good to have you here.
Thank you.
So, Dr. Goodyear is the Dean of the School of Leadership at Dallas Baptist University, and he has been working in politics and with political philosophy for a number of years now. And so today we're going to be talking about the state of politics in our country, as well as the place for evangelicals and evangelicalism in politics. So, again, thanks for being here.
Yeah, glad to be here. Thank you.
So, I want to begin by just simply asking you if you could give briefly just some thoughts on what you see trending in the political landscape right now as far as what's happening with Republicans and Democrats and where Christians find themselves in the midst of it.
Well, I should start off, my views are solely my own, so I don't speak for any organization or group. But where we are politically now, I would say we are in a very trying space right now, especially for Christians in the political landscape. I think there's a generational change as well. It depends on what generation you're talking about. We're talking about politics today and where Christians fit into that. I do believe in that our political parties, while they're very important to be a part of, have tended to both kind of go towards the margins, towards the edges, which has left a lot of people kind of in the middle, unsure of where to go, or feeling forced to go one direction.
Yeah.
Perhaps they don't want to go. And so I think Christians are in a unique space because we should be naturally bridging the gap between some of these issues politically that we're dealing with, but yet so many times I think we find ourselves forced to choose one of these sides. And so it's a unique space that we're in right now. I don't think we always manage it well. I think there are people managing it very well. And when we say something about speaking for evangelicals or talking about evangelicals, that's so many different groups as well. And so where we fit in that is a very complicated conversation in itself. But yeah, we're not in the best of places right now in our culture politically and how we're fitting into that.
We find people saying if you're a Christian, you can't be a Democrat, or if you're a Christian, you shouldn't be a Republican, or when you get into the third party candidates and the things that they stand for, you have even more, I think, if you will, just sort of extremism going, no, this is really bad over here. And I think that we fail to recognize that good-hearted people tend to fall on all different spots and sides of the various political spectrum.
Right, definitely, and it's something really important to understand that our Christian identity should never be tied to a political identity, right? And so that's an important thing to remember. It's an important thing I try to help my students see that, as you mentioned, Christians are on both sides of the political aisle. There's nothing in the Bible that says you have to vote a certain way in order to be a Christian, and so
that makes sense. In the Bible, you have in the Old Testament the idea that the religion and the government of the people is sort of married together. It's you follow the law of God, and if you're an Israelite, and that is how you are governed. And in the New Testament, you find Jesus talking about submitting to authority. You find Paul talking about submitting to authority, and Peter. And one of the interesting things about 1 Peter is that he mentions submitting to unjust authority. And a few years after he wrote that, both Peter and Paul were arrested and put to death unjustly by the Roman government. But they were living in an era where Christians had virtually no political voice whatsoever. And so the idea of us even having the ability to make our voices heard in politics is something that many people in the biblical era had no concept of.
That's very true. And I think we have to use those scriptures very carefully in our own context of when we obey authority and when we are submitting to authority, but yet questioning anything that's unjust as well. That doesn't just simply mean being silent and not saying anything. Recognizing that we're under that authority, that we're going to pay the consequences for something if we speak out, but yes, being willing to do so. And that's a privilege that we have, particularly in this country, that a lot of people haven't had throughout history.
Throughout history, yeah. What are some things you think are important for Christians to keep in mind when trying to have discussions about political topics to, say, remain civil or Christ-like in love, or whatever else you might
Yeah,
say of the issue.
that can be hard. I think the number one thing we have to remember as Christians is we have to have humility in all of our conversations. None of us have arrived at the definitive answer. We sometimes like to say the Bible says or the Bible says, but yet we often see that Christians interpret that very differently. And so we can proof text or different things to try to shore up our side. But if we go into a conversation in politics with humility and with recognizing that I could be wrong, then I think it opens up the opportunity for a good dialogue. To recognize that if we disagree politically, is nothing that I should be then trying to attack you personally, or that I should try to be defensive about myself personally, but that we can have a dialogue and a disagreement with humility being the key thing. Second thing, along with that humility comes to being open to different ideas, different viewpoints, and recognizing that there are different viewpoints. And then also making sure that we're reading widely as Christians, that if we're wanting to engage in discussions, what have we done on our own, research-wise, reading-wise, that has informed us, even beyond what we may think is the right answer? What are we reading beyond our own views that are helping to inform that and continue to grow in our relationship with that? And if you haven't changed any of your political views in your lifetime, then I think you're probably not doing enough of that, right? There should be this tension, ongoing tension, and almost evolution of our political viewpoints as we get to know Christ better. That's going to change, and some of our circumstances are going to change some of our understandings of how we do politics, and I think that's perfectly fine, not anything to be ashamed of.
Yeah, very good. I think that you oftentimes see things where on social media and that kind of stuff where people really push an agenda. But it seems like a lot of times when they're pushing that agenda, they haven't even really thought through all the implications of it or what the other side is even really arguing. The idea of reading beyond, your own point of view or reading widely is really important for a number of reasons. But one is it helps you think more critically about your own views.
Right.
And if you aren't seeing what the other side says, then how do you really know that your solution actually fixes all the problems associated with whatever that topic is? With politics especially, you've got people who are pushing for certain things because they believe in their heart this is the right way to govern our people with regard to whatever the topic is. And if people didn't think it was the right way or a true way or a good way, they wouldn't be pushing for it. So they've got to have some kind of reason.
Right, definitely. And to be open to dialogue doesn't mean that you don't have an opinion, that you don't share that. But yeah, making sure that you're sharing that, you're striving to do justly, love mercy, and walk humbly in the way we do politics. And that means you're going to be trying to do justice. It also means that you're going to have the mercy side of it too. And it also means you have to have that humility side. But definitely, because politics is so ugly, sometimes we tend to then want to say, well, I'm not going to be part of it at all. And that, to me, is just as wrong as just being the knucklehead in the conversation that is not listening to anybody else. Our disengagement from politics, I don't believe, would be obedient to God's call for us either. I think we need to be engaged in politics, engaged in what's happening in our world today. And if we're not being an influence on that, if we're not providing a voice into that, then I don't think we're doing fully what our calling is in this world to live out our faith.
Yeah, I think people talk all the time about being in the world and not of it. And the idea of being of the world is being characterized by the sinful aspects of the world. And we're not to be people who are characterized by sinful behaviors. But we are to live in the world in a way that engages the community around us and that builds that community together. I mean, the whole purpose of God putting Adam in the garden and telling him, be fruitful and multiply was, hey, go build a community, create a society, work together, and be a group. It wasn't ever meant for us to be loners or to even segregate ourselves from the rest of society at large.
Right, definitely. Yeah, that's one commandment we've obeyed in our history is to be fruitful and multiply, right? We've done that fairly well in the world, but there's 7 billion people, and it's a matter of how do we continue to love all the other 6.999 billion other than us, and also serve them and be that Christian witness. And we can only do that by being part of that community.
Yeah, very good. One of the things I've seen you talk about in social media over the last year or two has had to do with evangelicals, some of them not really feeling like they have a political home anymore, because you have both sides, as you mentioned earlier, kind of moving to these extremes, where a lot of people are left sort of alienated, going, I don't really identify with either party now.
Right.
What are some things you would say to Christians to sort of help try to see what we can do to sort of bridge that gap or reformulate things a little bit?
Yeah. One thing, aside from the along with humility aspect, is recognize that it is okay to be independent. It is okay to not be part of a political party, even as much as that we're socialized in a way in our culture to be part of a political party. We've always had that, and so it's a strong desire. We probably grew up with relatives being one particular party, and so we have that as part of who we are. But as the parties continue to go, if we're left with two bad choices, it doesn't mean that we have to choose one of the bad choices.
Sure.
And I think as Christians, if we want better choices, or as people, if we want better choices, then sometimes that means you don't vote for either of the options. It's not, if you're doing with your vote what you feel like you should do with your vote, you're voting your conscience, you're not wasting your vote, no matter what people say about that. You won't get better candidates if you just continue to say, well, we have to choose between one of these two. Now, that being said, there's a flip side to that, and the fact that I say I'm independent. Well, if more of us continue to be independent, then that leaves the extremes left in the parties, and the candidates continue to be extreme. And so it's kind of this battle between not wanting to associate perhaps with some of the things that are coming from each of these parties, but at the same time, how in our system, how do we influence that? And thankfully, in like a state like Texas, for example, it's an open primary state, so on election day, you can choose whether to vote in the Democratic primary or Republican primary, so you can kind of see where you most can make your influence. So even if you don't consider yourself part of a party, I think there is even in that primary stage an important aspect of trying to help influence those parties. But I think I kind of got off topic there a little bit with where you were going with that. But the difficulty of trying to maneuver through this party structure that's kind of become more and more polarized isn't easy. But and also part of it is people who are in the middle don't ever really see representation of themselves on television because right, the news media, what draws ratings is upset, angry people, right? And so if you had a panel of moderates there saying, well, you know, that's boring television, so you have to have somebody over here and somebody over here, that's what makes it more exciting. But then that can sometimes leave us with the idea that there's only these two groups. Right. And we forget that there's this middle in there somewhere in that paradigm.
As with most cases, more people fall sort of in the middle than onto either extreme. Right. You find that, you know, the documentary Bill Maher did a few years ago, Religulous, and he sets out to look at these religious extreme people, but the way the documentary sort of portrays itself is like most Christians are crazy, outlandish, you know, and that's a relatively small portion of anybody that considers themselves a Christian. But you could say the same thing about Muslims and jihad, you know. Right. When you look at the extremist Muslims, they're a relatively really small portion of Muslims. Right. And in the same way with politics, you've got the extremists who are on TV, especially, you know, a lot of talk show hosts and not late night talk show, but, you know, NPR type hosts tend to either fall on this extreme or that extreme, and that's what you get on their show, which may not really reflect most mainline people's thinking. Definitely. Which is important to continue on your dialogue with your community, with your family, with your friends, with your group of people around you, to kind of shore that up. And that's been a good thing these last couple of years as working with college students and a lot of them seeing, you know, engaging the political process for the first time, an awareness that
we can have these dialogues and these discussions and kind of continue to form our views, and knowing that can be a process for us as we go through that, can be a good thing to kind of assure ourselves of as we're
Sure.
going through that.
Concerning Christianity and us as Christians in a country where we have the opportunity to vote, we have the opportunity to make decisions about who to put into office, not just at the national level, but at the state level, at the local level. I think city elections are just as important as state or national elections for a lot of reasons. I mean, just who you put on your city council affects the direction your city is going to move for the next several years. So what are some principles you think would be good to perhaps guide Christians as they learn to decide for themselves what kind of people to vote for, or what kind of how to think about certain issues when it comes down to voting?
I always would say, take the issues that are important to you and list them out, and make sure that you know where the various candidates stand on those issues that are important to you. And those are going to vary from national, as you mentioned, down to local. And so recognizing, knowing what those issues are, I always shy away from, or try to, from one issue becoming dominant in all of that.
I think that's a real problem, and there's a lot of people that are very much a one issue, single issue voters. And the thing is that a lot of times those single issues may not even come up during that person's term.
Right. It may not be something that happens then. It may be something that you then choose a candidate based on this one issue, and you excuse everything else over here. Of course, it's all of our votes. So if you want to be a one issue voter, that's your choice. But I think you're shortchanging the process of looking through the issues and laying them out. And it's really important. You mentioned the local election stuff. So few people vote at the local level, which is crazy, because you have a greater likelihood of running into your mayor or your school board member at the grocery store than you do the President of the United States, right? And it's those people at that school board and local level that impact much more of our lives. And you can see the importance of good leadership in our cities. Where's the first response in times of tragedy? It comes from your local officials. If you have a shooting in your neighborhood, if you have some sort of a disaster that occurs, the response of your local officials is way more important than the national government. The national government is going to be slow to get in there. But if you have good ethical leaders, good Christian leaders who are able to guide a community through a tragedy like that, it makes such a huge difference. And so, but yet so few people vote on those, and so few people are actually willing to engage and actually run for those offices. That's another thing we need to make sure we encourage is that we see are there skills that we have that can help us engage in some of these offices as well.
I don't know how many times I've gone to the polls and there's only been one name to vote for, in local elections. So,
definitely.
Very good. Well, what are any other bits of advice you would have for Christians wanting to engage politics that maybe we haven't talked about today?
Yeah, I do. I think one of the most important things to me as American, as a Christian, is our idea of religious freedom, religious liberty. And I think as Christians, we even need to make sure that we're advocating that for people of all faiths. That it's not just about whether or not we can practice our Christian faith, but it's whether a Muslim can practice his faith, a Jew can practice her faith, an atheist can practice no faith. That as people who should value religious freedom, we should be on the forefront of protecting everybody's ability to believe what they want to believe. And sometimes we don't do that very well. Sometimes we call persecution something that's not really persecution, when there's a lot of persecution going on around the world that we need to be more aware of and making impact on. But I think that freedom of conscience and the ability for us as Christians to be promoting that for all people is extremely important, and something that sometimes I feel like we do lose in our own self-interest of how we just get to where we want to get.
I think that's really important. One of the persons who's been a big influence on the way I think about politics is Michael Lindsay, who's a sociologist. He he wrote a book called Faith in the Halls of Power.
Mhm.
And in that book, he talks about when we do things as Christians for society, we need to do things for the good of all of society, not
Mhm.
just for those who are like-minded like us, you know.
Yeah.
And in his book, he talks about religious liberty,
Mhm.
and the idea that, you know, if we want to have the ability as Christians to do this, we should also be fighting for the ability for the Jehovah's Witnesses or the Mormons, whoever else, to have that same ability.
Mhm.
And as you mentioned, you know, I think even this week I saw an article in the news about a group of Christians protesting the government accepting some other religion's plea for something.
Mhm.
But yet you also find Christians in the news in the same week saying we're being persecuted for this.
Right.
Well, if we're going to say we're being persecuted, we can't turn around and become persecutors of others either.
Right.
Part of the beauty of religious liberty is that we give freedom for people of any faith to practice that faith so long as it does not hinder the freedoms of other people.
Yeah.
So,
And that's where the importance of coming back and understanding our history comes into play. Because if you go back to the founding of our country here in the U.S., you had established churches in the various colonies and various states, and you had, I'm a Baptist, you had Baptists and Methodists being called a sect or a cult because they weren't part of the established organization. And so we were huge, traditional Baptists are huge proponents for religious freedom. Well, what happened over time as we grew in number and as we grew in that influence, began to have more power in the halls of power, that temptation to say, well, let's just cap this off for us, and we're not as big of champions anymore. And so having that check on power for ourselves, I think as Christian leaders, if we're in politics, having people who are holding us accountable, not just surrounding ourselves with people who are going to tell us what we want to hear, but making sure that we're surrounding ourselves with people who will call us whenever we're doing something wrong, to even put term limits on ourselves as far as how long we engage in a certain issue. Because what other Christian leaders will say is, you know, that first time you get a call from the White House for example, to give your advice on something is pretty exciting, and you want to make sure that the temptation is, you want to make sure you're called back again, right?
Sure.
And so the temptation is, when you're called to give your opinion on something, to say, well, maybe I should say what they want to hear so that I can continue to have this access. And I think that that's something else that we need to make sure we're being true to who we are. And sometimes that's going to end up closing a door, perhaps, if we tell somebody what. But also as leaders, we need to make sure we have people in our own lives, that we allow people in our own lives to tell us the same thing, and not to shut them out, but allow those voices to continue to speak to us, to correct us when we need to, because we're just as guilty in this as any non-Christian, as far as abusing power or not accepting accountability or covering up things that we, that power, that temptation of power can be very corrupting, and so we need to make sure that we're holding ourselves accountable in politics and in other areas of leadership as well.
Yeah, certainly. So, well, thank you for your time today.
Yeah.
I appreciate you being here. To sort of recap, you know, it's important as Christians to engage culture. It's important for Christians in culture to engage politics and to have the open-mindedness to explore other views, to have the open-mindedness to see if other perspectives may have something good to offer that should be incorporated into your own thinking. And it's important to remember that what you think about politics doesn't define exclusively who you or anyone else is. And as such, you don't use politics as a way to alienate people, separate yourself from people, or dissolve relationships with people. Instead, you allow for disagreements, room for disagreements, because different people who are both caring and good-hearted towards the state of the government may have different views on how to fix problems in the government. And we live in a culture where we can make that voice, make our own voice known and heard, and we should embrace that and encourage that all across the political spectrum. So, all right. Well, thank you for your time today.
Thank you.
And we'll see you next time.